All right. Hey, welcome. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Eve Stein, and I work at Solar One, and welcome to Clean Energy Connections, a creation of Solar One and Acre in partnership with Green Tech Media. I am the Downstate Program Manager for NYSERDA's EDGE program, where I manage outreach for NYSERDA's programs in New York City, Long Island, and Westchester. This event has been a cornerstone of our outreach to the clean tech community for, I believe, about the past 5 years. So tonight we'll be discussing the next opportunity at the grid edge to focus on large energy consumers. And this is the first of 4 panels that will be held throughout the year focusing on next generation energy. The electric power industry is entering a new phase in its evolution. The emergence of distributed energy resources on the grid, once seen as a challenge to utilities, is opening up new revenue streams for technology vendors, private sector service providers, and utilities. The 4 events will highlight the stakeholders and technologies driving this evolution. Before we kick off the event, can I get a show of hands? How many people are here at Clean EC for the first time? Wow, this always astonishes me how we always get all these new people here, some regulars. So welcome to those of you who are new. Those of you who have been here, you will know this rap. Green Tech Media is live streaming this event. So if you need to get up, please avoid the cameras. The bar is closed during the event and will reopen after the event for networking. Be careful with your bottles because all the sounds get picked up in here. And of course, cell phones on mute. In-person audience members, this is an interactive discussion. So if you want to ask the panel questions, you can do one of the following. Those of you who are with us in the studio, you can write your questions on index cards. There'll be somebody going up and down the aisles. That's Simon over there. He's just raising his hand. So you can kind of give a little hand raise, just not in front of the camera, and he'll collect your cards and give them to the moderator. You can also tweet questions. So either you guys in the room or also the people who are joining us via live stream. You can tweet at CleanECNYC, and our hashtag is clean and the letters NRGX. And then I'd like to give a special shout out to our sponsors and partners, NYSERDA and the New York City Economic Development Corporation. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Steve Proper of Green Tech Media, and our panelists for the evening. Thanks, everybody.
All right, welcome everyone. Is that sound quality good? Great. Welcome everyone. Excited to have you all here and really looking forward to this discussion. As Rachel just mentioned, Steve Proper, Director of the Grid Edge program at GTM Research. I'm going to go through and introduce our panelists, throw out a couple of interesting stats to level set us for the discussion, and then we'll get into it. So immediately to my right is Phil Skalaski, right? VP of Engineering and Energy Services for the Durst Organization. Kylie Sale, Resource Management Specialist for Whole Foods. Vishnu Baran, Senior Business Development Manager for Energy Group. And Kirby Brenzel, Associate Director of Sustainability for Starwood Hotels and Resorts. Couple interesting things. This is an interesting group of folks representing kind of a cross-section of both large energy users as well as folks who work with large energy users on project implementation. And I just wanted to throw out why I personally think this is an interesting discussion, particularly for this audience. First, New York currently ranks number 3 in terms of CHP deployment. So we are certainly a hot market when it comes to CHP and are expected to see continued investment and growth in this area. The recent ITC extension suggests that there'll be a lot more growth in commercial solar. GTM's expecting 51% growth in commercial solar between now and 2020. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And we're also starting to see a lot of developments and interest in the commercial energy storage market, which we'll have a couple discussions on where folks here are kind of lie in terms of that technology. So kind of with that opening and level setting, I want to, we'll start easy and get a little bit more challenging as we go. But first question I'd like to ask, and we should go down the row and have everybody answer, is what do you think the greatest area of opportunity facing your business today? And in that, can you give folks kind of a sense of where you are in the organization and your priorities as it relates to energy management? We'll start with you, Phil.
So at the Durst Organization, we feel that our best opportunity is cogen at this point. We realize CHP is a great opportunity. Unfortunately, right now, we know that Coned and standby tariffs are kind of standing in the way. So moving forward, we're trying to work with Coned, with the PSC, with REBNY, and trying to get these standby tariffs changed a little bit so that they're a little bit more favorable for CHP. In terms of energy management, we're looking at some smart energy control systems. We're not sure if any of the systems we're currently looking at are actually there yet, but we're trying to look at HVAC and MEP systems on a system level basis, not just individual fans, motors, pumps, chillers. We're looking at it on a system level. So what happens when you make a small set point change on a floor? What does that do to the fans? How does that trickle back to the chillers? How does that trickle back up into the condenser water system? And what is the actual system curve of a building, which for every building it's different. And so that's kind of what we're looking at.
Great. Kylie?
Similarly to what you were saying, for Whole Foods Market, our biggest energy users are things like refrigeration, HVAC, lighting. So we are, working on energy monitoring upgrades and energy controls upgrades in all of our stores in the region, with the hope of then doing energy efficiency projects. So that's one of our biggest opportunities on older stores. We have stores that are 15 years old in the region, so they need a lot of upgrades to get on to the current level. And at Whole Foods, we have a 20% energy reduction by 2020, so working towards that goal with energy efficiency projects in all of those areas that I was talking about with refrigeration and lighting and HVAC. In terms of other opportunities that we're pursuing, it's new types of refrigeration, solar. We're looking at things like CHP and energy storage, and just really looking forward to new stores as well, improving new stores.
Great. Vishu?
So I'm the oddball in the room. I actually work for a company that manufactures cogen. So I'm a manufacturer and a service and maintenance company for implementation in these guys' buildings. And from our perspective, it's the barriers to implementation of some of the cogen systems. Similar to what my friend was saying over here, from the interconnect side of things, the standby tariffs, and the layers involved with New York City building codes. There's a lot of different classifications of buildings. Some classifications will allow you to use natural gas for emergency loads. Not many people have the requirement or the legal requirements NFPA 110 for cogen. So there's a whole mix of standards and requirements which can kind of slow down the implementation to cogen, by which time 2 or 3 years may have passed before you've conceived a project to actually implementation of a project.
Sure thing. So Kirby Brenzel with Starwood. We have 1,100 properties in over 100 countries all around the world. And in terms of what's the next big thing, it's not a question of what's the next big one thing. I think energy management and sustainability and looking at things like alternatives, it isn't really so much a silver bullet, it's more silver buckshot. You have to take all of the solutions that are available out in the field and bring them to bear for not only your properties, but also for you as an organization. And I think it's finding that key, really kind of, determining what works best under what scenarios, under what, we're going to talk about some of these things in the rest of the panel as we go along, under what types of different geographic preferences, under what, legislative barriers. I mean, what is that solution and how do you apply it there? That's the key. That's what makes this tricky, but that's really what makes it fun. So,
great. Good segue, Kirby, because I want to get into a bit of a kind of policy discussion, and specifically as it relates to New York. Kylie, I think both you and Phil have a couple of thoughts in terms of, give us a sense, what's worked well so far in New York in terms of policy to help drive some of your more kind of aggressive energy management goals, and what do you think the state and some of the local utilities should be looking at more seriously in terms of helping to stimulate some of your project work?
Sure. Well, we worked really closely with NYSERDA for example, the Brooklyn store where we have solar, where we have a CHP system. And part of the learning curve that we found was that, we really needed someone who could bring together all the parties in one place and bring them all together. So NYSERDA with the incentives, the utility, us, the systems themselves. Because what happened at Brooklyn was we had two types of renewable energy, which was the solar and the CHP, and then Con Ed wouldn't allow us to export, so that was doing strange things to our system. So if we had kind of a mediator or some body in between all of us to facilitate all of this, that could have really helped us smooth out that process.
Phil?
So from a policy standpoint, again, from tariffs and dealing with Con Ed, at some of our new properties, actually, our new developments, one of which is Hallett's Point in Queens, we decided to build a off-the-grid cogen plant. That's a 2.1 million square foot residential complex made up of 5 buildings. We decided to actually put in 3 cogen plants in 3 out of 5 buildings. We tie all the buildings together on a microgrid, and we're just bringing gas into the site, no electric. Because unfortunately, the standby tariffs are so they're so egregious in some cases that that's a good word to use. That it doesn't pay to pay the standby cost. We'd rather pay more for resiliency, redundancy, multiple engines, multiple levels of redundancy. That's a one-time capital cost as opposed to an ongoing standby charge for the life of the building or the life of the plant. The problem, though, again, now we're running off the grid, which means most of the time we're not going to be running at more than maybe 50% of one engine in some cases. Maybe we're running, at some point we're never running at 100% because we have all this redundancy to make sure that we don't go down because we're off the grid, that we can't truly base load the system. So again, we can't help support the grid. We can support ourselves, but it would be great to be able to connect that to the grid and help support everyone else. Unfortunately, the tariff, Con Ed believes that everything needs to be, they use there's a term for it, revenue neutral. They need to be revenue neutral. And therefore, they're saying that anybody that's on that tariff needs to supplement that extra facilities to support that standby power to the building, instead of actually going after the rest of the people on the grid, or not going after, but making the other people that are part of the grid pay for that service, which would, again, we're helping the resiliency of the grid if we're connected to the grid. If we're not connected to the grid, we're not helping that resiliency. So,
Vishnu, you have some good comparisons from outside New York. How do we kind of stack up, and what are your thoughts in terms of projects you've implemented both here and in other geographies?
Oh, I've worked in the UK for quite a long time before I came here. And cogen in the UK is a massive, massive subject. Building regulations and planning permissions kind of incentivize or force developers to put cogen in, or to put a portion of on-site generation. That could be cogen, could be wind, could be solar PV. I think what I've seen here, and I think NYSERDA is an amazing advocate of helping some of this stuff happen, and I've also seen Con Ed become a lot easier to work with over the last 3 or 4 years. There's a lot of policy like NECHP and WADE, the Northeast Clean Heat and Power Institute, and the World Alliance for Decentralized Energy. They're kind of trying to push some of the policy sides. But I think outside of New York, we've got projects going on in Massachusetts down to Maryland. It's kind of like standardization of, say, interconnects and standardizations of some of the requirements to actually implement the cogen and connect it electrically. Here in Con Ed, within the 5 boroughs, there's these red and green zones that can potentially be added cost to implementation of cogen. You've got NYSERDA on one arm saying that they'll incentivize a cogen project if it can run in island mode, i.e. with or without the utility. But then you need to add in additional equipment like inverters or current limit fuses to protect the utility, because the utility's old or the transformers don't have any short circuit current capacity. Cogen, because we don't have a neutral, we have the potential to add fault level to a facility, so there could be some additional costs which can, for these guys here, kill a payback that you're trying to achieve as a developer, or add a bunch of costs or more things to maintain, which is changing. But I think whereas sort of in the UK, I've never seen a cogen go in with an inverter. It's always been straight synchronous and been able to connect direct to the utility. And sometimes if the utility have got issues with their equipment, they have to upgrade their equipment as opposed to the customers or the developer side having to upgrade that equipment.
Kirby, do you have any thoughts?
Sure. So, and we at Starwood, and I personally have worked with NYSERDA and always appreciate the chance to do those things with them. But me personally, so we have properties in over 100 countries all throughout the world, and I tend to be kind of a glass is half full type of guy. So I think there's always room for improvement, and I think that's definitely something that we could look for here in this local market as well.
Great. So I know a number of you are looking at kind of some more alternative energy projects or projects that are beyond just cogen or potentially CHP. Phil, I know you're working on a microgrid, and I think some other folks are. Can you kind of talk through a little bit more, kind of give folks a sense of kind of what the project is, what kind of has led you down this path, and kind of what you're seeing in terms of early benefits from an economics perspective?
So again, at Pallet's Point in Queens, and we're building, its total capacity is 6.4 megawatts, of which we only really need 4.8 megawatts. So we have 3 plants going in. The first plant is actually 2 800 kW engines, and then we have 2 spare 8 kW engines. Again, it's phased. Part of the benefit is being off the grid. Typically, gas prices index electric prices. So as gas prices climb, electric price will climb. We'll get those paybacks. Also, it's a residential facility, so we're allowed by the Public Service Commission to charge an electric rate to the residents, similar to exactly what they would pay to Con Ed, so it doesn't change for the tenant. What we're also doing is we're actually making chilled water and hot water. We're running hot water to the apartments. We're running chilled water to the apartments in the summertime. We're also actually going to charge for that chilled water, because chilled water is considered or air conditioning is considered a benefit. So we'll charge for it, but we're going to charge it at a reduced rate, or at a rate that's more favorable to the tenant than if they had a heat pump in there or a water-cooled AC unit in their apartment. So again, the tenants are getting a benefit out of this. The building is getting a huge benefit, or the complex is getting a huge benefit in terms of carbon footprint. Right now, our energy savings is on the order of 60% less than a baseline building in terms of actual carbon. That's not budget cost method. That's actually taking the energy and equating it using e-grid numbers into actual carbon numbers and understanding what that carbon footprint really will be versus a baseline or ASHRAE 2010 baseline building. So we're seeing huge benefits in terms of carbon doing something like this.
Pallet, you had an interesting example of kind of work that you guys are doing in terms of carbon, refrigeration, and kind of looking at sort of measuring projects a little bit of a different way, or looking at it differently. Do you want to expand on that?
Sure. So we were talking earlier about, the different ways of looking at projects. Is it really just the savings, or is there something else that could justify a project to leadership? And we were talking about how one of the things is, the carbon benefits of it. So I was talking about different types of natural refrigerants that we're looking into and using in many different places across the country. So CO2, for example, where a regular refrigerant would have a global warming potential that's very high in multiple thousands versus CO2, which is just 1-to-1. So things like that can help justify a project where there might not even be cost parity. It might be more expensive to put in these systems, but the global benefit of them is so great that it's worth it.
Great. Vishnu, along this vein, but a little bit different, how, in terms of what you're seeing from some of your clients and folks in terms of project implementation, how automated are large energy users looking to be, and in that automation, kind of what are kind of the key drivers and fundamentals and features that they're looking for?
So on another side of our business, we're kind of an ESCO, so we look at holistic projects for buildings, and we'll look at implementation of low-hanging fruit, lights, VFDs, new controls, nighttime setback, that type of stuff. And I think to answer the question, a lot of it really depends on the portfolio and the size of some of these organizations and how much energy is a pain in their or a thorn in their side. Right. Automation is obviously a good thing from my experience to a point, and just to jump off the back of your last conversation, before I was at Energy, I was on the straight engineering side, and I used to work for a really big supermarket chain in Europe that built a bunch of carbon neutral stores. And it was quite an interesting thing to do. We built a store in the UK called Tesco Ramsey, and Tesco was the company. And the store was made of wood. It had a biodiesel CCHP, so a tri-generation system running on fish oil. It had CO2 refrigeration. It had natural ventilation via wing catchers, so these pipes on the roof that used to catch the ventilation and force it down into the building. We had sun pipes, we had hydrocarbon chillers, and it was about a 40,000 square foot store. And if you were to benchmark that from an energy cost running perspective to one of their standard stores that was connected to the utility and had natural gas supply, it cost them 3 times as much a year to run it. Because it consumed so much energy, and the cost of this biodiesel wasn't cheap. And all right, it was certified by Ofgem in the UK to be a zero greenhouse gas fuel, but the cost of getting it there, and then where we used to get this fuel from, we actually have our own refinery in Liverpool, and we have a few guys that run around in trucks and go to all the docks, and after the fish the trawlers come in the morning, we collect up all the waste scales and stuff, and we take it to our refinery in Liverpool. And we add some magic chemicals to it and refine it, clean it, and the carbon footprint of getting from London 350 miles up the road to Liverpool in a diesel-based truck running on number 6 oil, maybe just joking, but and then getting it back down to the site probably negated any carbon benefit that it really had. But that was and I ran the energy and sustainability program for this supermarket chain, and in 2008, the UK introduced a carbon tax for anyone that consumed over 6 million kilowatt hours. So they kind of went energy efficiency crazy. I did 176 CHPs for these guys from 2008 to 2011 with every CHP company out in the world. So had a fair amount of experience. And now if you look at their building stock, everything is very heavily automated. And you can go to a point, but things like, if you go back to cogen, or a lot of the monitoring systems, the NYSERDA requirements for them to provide a grant for a cogen system, they have to sign a 5-year warranty or a bumper-to-bumper maintenance contract, as Mr. Dana likes to call it, for his CHP system. And you can go so far with it, but if a cylinder's starting to fail or it needs a spark plug change, you can't automate that, right? So you need to get somebody physically to go out there and to do that piece of work. So there's a level that works. Going back to the supermarket chain, they had 3,600 stores when I left the UK, so energy was a big concern for them. One of my big clients that I've got over here now, they spend 80 million a year on energy just in the 5 boroughs, and we're doing a bunch of CHP with those guys. And obviously the first thing that everybody wants to see when you're selling it up the chain is money savings, but then some of the corporate responsibilities for carbon footprint start to come into play, especially when you're international. And there's European legislation that drives certain entities to be carbon friendly. And then obviously nowadays, since I moved here 3 weeks before Hurricane Sandy, the resilient side of buildings and having reliable buildings and places of refuge, because a lot of cogens can act, they peak shave, for want of a better word, when the utility is available. But our cogen, which are synchronous-based cogen, can also run in island mode, so they can also operate off the grid and provide a portion of power to buildings. And one of the big drivers for this customer of mine right now was the owner of this company. A, wanted to be able to drive around his fancy buildings and see the lights on, but B, wanted people to be able to charge their cell phones. And that was one of the drivers for implementation of these systems.
Right.
Kirby, you just kind of backpacking off of that. You
Sure.
at Starwood, obviously cost is something that you look at in terms of kind of evaluating projects, but you also, there are a number of other kind of factors and kind of characteristics that you look at Starwood. Can you kind of elaborate a bit in terms of kind of how you evaluate projects and maybe some kind of more unique, non-obvious kind of implementations that are happening within your portfolio?
Sure thing, no problem. And similar to Kylie and Whole Foods, Starwood is driven. Our North Star is our 30-20 by 20 goal. And so this is a 30% energy reduction and a 20% water reduction by the year 2020. And we just added carbon on just this last year at 30% as well. So we really use that to focus on. So that's kind of what we're driving for. Now with that, in the kind of the evaluation of projects that we bring to the table, and I talked about that we look at a plethora of different ones.
Sure.
So, I mean, right now we have over 40 different AE installations all around the globe. We use a triple bottom line approach. Now I know based on the audience and what I saw for the folks here, this is very common to you, but it's people, planet, profit. And all of those we weigh as a factor to make sure that we're evaluating these projects correctly. But to reiterate what Vishnu said as well, I mean, it is that bottom line. It is, how much are we able to say that this is an effective, profitable project from a cost perspective? Yep. And when Starwood looks at its portfolio, we have both owned, managed, and franchised properties. So we have to work with our owners to make sure that we are giving them something that's a good option, something that they're going to want to do, not just something that's going to be green for green's sake. In terms of novel approaches or different things that we've done recently, I've also tended to really kind of stratify the projects into ones that are what's shovel ready, what's something that I can do right now where I can make a difference without a huge lift right away. I know there are a lot of great opportunities out there and a lot of really good things that we can do, but we've really kind of focused recently on making sure that we can put points on the scoreboard for us at Starwood and for us as an organization in as efficient a manner as possible. So that's something that we've really kind of looked at recently as well.
Great. I'd like to pivot a little bit and talk about kind of the community aspect of some of your projects. Phil, can you guys own and manage a lot of real estate here in New York. How has community planning and community involvement kind of impacted how you've looked at new energy management projects?
Again, the biggest community impact right now that we're having is at Hallett's Point. I go back to this because it was an industrial area that's being rezoned as residential. It's on the waterfront in Astoria. It's by an existing NYSERDA facility that we're actually, again, bringing the area up. Again, there wasn't a lot over there, so there's a whole waterfront rebuild. There's going to be possibly a school. So we're looking at all these aspects of these buildings and trying to make sure, again, that carbon footprint is as little as possible so that we're not truly affecting the neighbors that are still there, that we're being part of the community. Again, affordable housing is a big thing with the city right now, so part of these buildings, affordable housing is part of them. And again, having this cogen plant that is truly off the grid, we hope to be running, obviously we have to be running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and even when we do have storms or other problems with the grid, we will be running and trying to be as resilient as possible. So,
great. Kylie, you had some examples from your Brooklyn store that were interesting in terms of kind of community aspect.
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on what you said, we always try and work with the community, and we always do work with the community to make the store best fit where the store is going. So the Gowanus store in Brooklyn, for example, that was a whole, site remediation. It was a super fund. And we worked with the parks, like you said, to make the water side on the Gowanus into, a playable park for the community. It's bringing healthy food in with the grocery store and things like that.
Great. Kirby?
Sure. So similar items. I mean, we really think about our properties as the footprint within the community in which they operate. So, whether it's New York City or it's St. John or it's the Virgin Islands, that property is a footprint within that community. And from the standpoint of resiliency, could not agree with that more. So making sure that you have that power that's available as we start to think about things like adaptation, climate change, and resiliency, and making sure that we're ready for that at our properties. as well as other factors. And I know ostensibly our panel is about energy today, but I think energy and water are intrinsically linked. So making sure that not only your guests, but your associates and your people who are in that workplace or in that community have access to those things is extremely important. As well as, thinking about it from other additional factors as well. So one of the great things we've been able to do is really kind of the integration of AE into the experience for the property. So what do I mean by this? Our solar installation at the Phoenician in Arizona, we tried to think about what can we do to add to the experience of our guests as we think about AE. And what we did was, it's a standard kind of on-site solar implementation where you have rooftop, carports, throughout the property. We use those carports now as part of the venue. So we will cover the area under the solar panels. In Phoenix, it's dry heat, so you can actually have an event over there out of the sun. And our guests love it, and we love it. So you can have, the Brenzel bar mitzvah there, and everybody can have a great time.
So if your next wedding should be at the Phoenician.
Well, I'm going to stick with the wedding I already have. Thank you very much. As my wife is watching at home. So
yeah,
hi,
Vishnu.
Could I just add a point as a newbie coming in town? Moving here just before Sandy and seeing obviously what happened in Sandy. And, I remember my bosses were in Washington and I was in Queens. And they were coming into Manhattan as Sandy was coming in. And they didn't leave for 2 weeks after that. They couldn't get out. And a lot of the buildings here historically, in terms of on-site power, they had a lot of diesel generators. And even, if the diesel generators, New York City code only allows you to have 275 gallons of storage available. And once that's gone, nobody was able to get any fuel around here. And the generators that were up high, the fuel storage tanks or the pump sets to get it up were all at low level. They either got flooded or they ran out. Mm-hmm. Natural gas sort of kind of came into its own, and a lot of the case studies that I saw around that time were buildings that had natural gas cogen that were able to keep running because gas is buried under the ground in a pipe and it's a little bit more reliable in some instances. Obviously not if you've got a fire, but when fuel's not available, natural gas generation kind of came into its own. So New York and New Jersey were two of the first states to actually certify natural gas as a prime fuel for emergency applications for certain classifications of buildings.
I'd like to build off what Vishnu said a little bit, and it's just, it's that gamut. So it can be anything as easy as, and this is your point on Superstar Sandy is exactly apropos. So that is exactly what we did here. People wanted to come in and charge their phones at a minimum, or take a hot shower. Those are things that we did. To the other extreme, which is what can we do to help from an emergency response standpoint? If you are one of the few places with electricity, what can you do in these instances when they come up?
As well, right?
Yeah, it's a huge deal, and it kind of just goes back to that point I raised before, where you are that footprint within the community, and how integrated you are makes a big difference, not only to the property, but to all those folks around it.
Yeah, on that, now that I'm thinking about it, on that point, I'm curious how, particularly for the large C&I folks on the panel, how willing are you to pay a premium for resiliency?
Me personally, or?
No, it's an interesting topic. So as we at Green Tech Media have been doing research around kind of microgrids and where that's potentially applicable, and thinking through kind of the economics behind solar plus storage or energy storage deployments, a common theme that's coming up is, the technology costs for some of these, if they are grid connected, are still kind of high and don't have longer payback periods than I think a lot of folks are really ready for, which suggests that if those projects were to move forward, that there's an appetite for kind of paying for or getting a bit of an insurance policy for resiliency or reliability. So I'm just curious, kind of, is that thesis true? And if so, kind of how much is sitting in a Whole Foods or a Starwood or a Durst position, are you kind of willing to pay from either a personal technology perspective or within kind of rates and pricing signals to get to close to 100% reliability?
On some of our new residential properties, one of which is the Via at West 57th, might have seen it, the tetrahedron. That should be coming online very shortly. That building is in a floodplain, so a lot of this, the way we looked at the building, we took a lot of the systems, made sure they were installed way above the floodplain, so really nothing other than some pumps are in the basement. We also looked at backup generators for that. Again, not so much cogen, because again, cogen was kind of backburnered because of these tariffs. It just didn't pay. But instead, we went back while we were designing the building, Superstorm Sandy actually hit, and we went back and looked at it, and we decided to put in an extra 1,000 kW natural gas generator as a standby generator so that we could run outlets to every single apartment so that people could actually have standby power. They'd have it, basically there'd be an outlet in that apartment that would be dead all the time. It would be labeled emergency use only. The minute we have a blackout, that generator turns on, powers up that outlet. People could heat their apartment, so the heat pump in the apartment would turn on, would actually have power to it. The outlet would have power, so they could charge their cell phone, run a light, do something like that, and the refrigerator would have power. Because another big problem with Superstorm Sandy, after it hit, people were throwing away tons of garbage because all the food was soiled, creating a health hazard. So we went ahead and we did that. Again, it was a premium cost, but we think it's going to pay off when it comes to renting these apartments and making sure the building's fully occupied.
Great. Any thoughts, Kylie?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's hard to quantify resiliency and how much it means. It's going to vary from store to store, whether it's in a place where the power is less reliable or in a floodplain, like you said. But I really think that that's kind of where the opportunity for NYSERDA and the utility and Whole Foods and everyone just to work together is. And so I look forward to seeing what's going to be coming up that's going to help companies like Whole Foods Market figure out how to make their buildings more resilient in affordable ways.
Kirby, you probably have some thoughts.
Sure. So, I mean, everything, just to be clear and upfront, everything has to foot and everything has to make sense from that triple bottom line perspective, including profit. So, everything has got to pencil. However, there are instances, as where you have a global portfolio, where it absolutely makes sense. So places where the grid is not very reliable, where electricity prices are absorbently high, so things like, maybe St. John, where it's 56 cents a kilowatt hour, there it just makes sense. These are times when, you can't even say it doesn't one way or another. It's just very, very glaringly obvious. However, in others it does not. So you have to look at it based on the absolute part of your portfolio and how it works for that necessarily nuanced market.
Great.
Just going back to my pre-energy days when I was working in the supermarket, I mean, 30 to 40% of the energy costs in a supermarket is refrigeration. Yeah. And one of the drivers behind, I mean, going back to my Tesco's days, they wanted the tills to keep running so they could still take cash. And they wanted, obviously, the means of egress to be available, but they wanted to keep that refrigeration going because, some of their stores were 200,000 or are 200,000 square foot. And there's a lot of refrigerated goods in there. If there's reliable power, obviously they can keep that going for as long as possible, maybe before they decant it into some mobile freezers or something. That was a cost benefit for them, as opposed to throwing away tons and tons of refrigerated goods.
Right. Well, besides Phil, another question I had, besides Phil's disdain for standby rates, Vishnu, let's start with you because you deal with quite a number of utilities. What, besides kind of resolving that issue, I think for folks within the Con Ed service territory, what else are you looking for or would you like to see from utilities to help kind of move these projects along? One of the things we talked about back in the green room was interconnection. That was kind of a big one, but if you can kind of elaborate on that, and we'll kind of go down the panel on this discussion.
Sure, and again, I think a lot of people hate on Con Ed a lot more than maybe they feel necessary. For the last 3 years, I've seen things improve within Con Ed territory, and all the utilities. It's a function of how you're generating power and how that impacts their equipment. And there's some utilities, that are more friendly. We've got stuff going on from National Grid to Eversource to Pepco to Con Ed to PSE&G to LIPA. And they've all got issues depending on the short-circuiting capability of the equipment that they've got, or whether it's a spot or it's a radial network. Obviously, the standardization of the Interconnect, which comes under IEEE 1547, means hopefully all the utilities are working towards one common goal. Most utilities have a standby tariff, as it's not just Con Ed, they all tend to have them. Con Ed's might be a little bit more onerous than some of the other utilities out there, but I've done a lot of studies recently based on some of the projects that I've got going on, and it really depends on how much power an end user's using and how you're changing the energy balance. But for the first year or two of being here and trying to implement projects, and one of the things being a new company and me having a British accent, which didn't help, but once things started moving and going, I don't really have a big problem personally. I don't see a big problem. We've got cogen and solar connected on the same meters in PSC. We haven't got it in Con Ed, but we've got it in PSC and G. In certain territories, we've come into the same issue that you've come into, where they won't allow us to export on the solar side. But I think things have improved personally from my experience of being here the last 3.5 years. The standby tariffs, again, are a pain in the ass. They really do cause some financial constraints, and it can take you, most customers are looking for a sub 5-year ROI, and that standby rates can take you out of that, which can kill a project. But again, as my friend was saying over there, here where we are, electric rates are really high and gas rates are fairly, they're not too bad. I don't see a big change in gas rates from us to Jersey. I mean, the electric rates I see a lot cheaper in Jersey than I do here. But what we're doing in displacing utility power and using gas to generate electricity, we're still making economic sense. So
the biggest problem we're seeing is on the larger scale.
Yeah, I'm only really doing small
when we're
scale
talking about
stuff.
small, Tecogens or small 100 kW units, things of that nature. Yeah, they do pay off. We had a couple micro turbines at the Helena. Unfortunately, they were installed prior to a fire department rule 50 that came out in 2008, so they sat there for 4 years, and then when we finally got them started up and running, they failed in a couple months, so those weren't good either. But again, small cogen we think works, especially, again, residential buildings where you can have hot water tanks where you can recover all that thermal energy and you can store it for use in peak times, nighttime, morning. We think that works great. When you get into the larger cogens, our experience, One Bryant Park, we have a 4.6 megawatt gas turbine cogen, which is grid tied. It's grid dependent because of the way it's interconnected with the grid. We really can't unconnect it without having to put in huge amounts of substation, huge amounts of equipment in a building on 42nd Street and 6th Avenue, which space is a premium. So we were grid tied at 13,000 volts to the Con Ed feeders. The amount of equipment needed to tie to those feeders, transfer trip systems so the grid can talk to us. So if the grid has a problem with the feeder we're connected to, they can pop us offline. Point-to-point T1 lines so that they can talk. There's telemetry between the systems. Anytime Con Ed needs to shut down that feeder, they have to come in and we have to swap out or rack out some breakers and rack back in a secondary breaker so we have a backup. There's a lot that goes into it. Another big problem is when we started the pro forma at One Bryant Park, it was back in 2006, I believe, and it showed a 10, 12-year payback. By the time it actually was implemented and turned on for commercial use in 2009, the standby rates skyrocketed. Again, the standby rate for steam, just to have the pipe through the wall, originally was $400 an M-pound in terms of contract demand. Now it's upwards of $1,900 an M-pound. We're at 38 M-pounds on a contract demand. If we don't use an ounce of steam, we still pay $1 million a year in standby charges to Con Ed on steam alone. That's just to have the pipe through the wall. We could put a boiler plant in, get a 6-year payback on that alone, which is what we're looking at doing now because we don't think those standby charges are going to change right away. Again, on the electric side, very difficult to do. Turned into the increase in rates on the standby, turned that 12-year payback into almost 20-year payback. So again, these are struggles that we've lived and we're still living right now. The system is up and running. The system is running well. PSC has changed some of there were some recent changes that are making that standby tariff better. One of the changes was an incentive. If we run throughout the summer on peak days and we run without shutting down, they'll give us an incentive because obviously we're helping the grid, we're running. So there was an incentive we just received starting in October. because we ran all throughout the summer without shutting down once. We didn't need that standby backup power for that 4.6 megawatts. So they reduced our contract demand down by 4.6 megawatts, which was a savings of approximately $300,000 a year. Great. We're almost there. We're still not there yet. I think a better, more favorable standby tariff, again, I think we need a standby tariff because if you're on a standard SC9 tariff, which is just the standard large tariff, if you're offline one day during a peak hour, you've killed your demand savings for the month. So a standby tariff is more of a daily ratchet. So if you're off one day, you only lose 1/30th of that month. So I think we need a better standby tariff from Con Ed and the Public Service Commission. We're just not sure if we'll ever get there, which is why we went the way we went at Hallett's Point.
That's one of the biggest issues with like cogen and understanding a customer's utility spend and how it's all set up and the different ratchet charges and when's the most optimum time to run a system and when's the best time to turn it off because of some of the as used charges that you can find. That's one of the tricky things for the business development guys on our end.
Kirby, did you have any kind of thoughts from a utility perspective?
Sure, I absolutely agree with Vishnu. I mean, the interconnection, I wish it could be easier and more standardized. I mean, it is very tough to do these, and it takes a lot of work, and a lot of times you feel like you're putting a square peg through a round hole. I'm also, just as a little bit of an aside, I'm also very excited about the recent ITC extension. That's been a big deal to us. It's allowed us to really be able to continue to look at projects that we were considering around solar. I would, however, like to disagree with one point that Vishnu brought up and just say that from a regional diction perspective, having a southern accent when it sneaks through for me every once in a while is not necessarily helpful either.
And I think just also big picture on utilities, like you said, standardization and also just communication in general. I have 2 different utilities in New York, 2 different utilities in Connecticut, and 2 different utilities in New Jersey. And it's just amazing, the better communicators, how much faster projects get done and how much easier it is to coordinate with them. So just communication in general as well.
I agree with that too. I've had instances where you're working with that utility and you do get some of them that bend over backwards to help you through the process. They're on the phone with you, making sure that you're filling out the form to the best of the ability so that you can get the project done. And I just love that. I mean, on the other hand, you don't necessarily always get that, but the ones who do make your job just that much easier.
Great. I have a couple more questions. I just want to make sure folks remember that if you have questions, I think everyone should have little index cards. Feel free to write them down, and a runner should be able to come by and pick those up for you if you raise your hand. And I know that some folks might be submitting some questions via Twitter, so we will get to those for sure. One topic or area which is interesting to me that really hasn't come up too much is, you just kind of mentioned it a little bit with the ITC around kind of commercial solar, but also energy storage. I know that there are definitely some areas, particularly out west, where solar and energy storage is particularly bullish and seeing a lot of investment. But Kirby, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts in terms of kind of solar projects or energy storage projects here in the Northeast, and how are you evaluating those to potentially pencil out?
Sure. So, and I think I get where you're going in terms of like the mix. So thinking about storage and thinking about other things in there. And we've already alluded to it once. I think, microgrid and other types of solutions like that, if you could bring those together, actually coupling them where they make sense, actually makes a huge difference. I mean, it's almost like a 1 + 1 = 3 type of scenario. From battery storage specifically, I mean, we are considering that and we are looking at it as potential options, but I mean, it's still in kind of that inception phase. So it's still one of these things that we're more interested in right now, considering and piloting, but you definitely get stuff that adds to the mix.
Great.
And I think also alluding to what you were both saying, where in the western side of the country it seems to pencil out more here. We're looking at a lot of rooftop solar, and that's great. We have a high electricity cost, and the cost of the solar can provide a lot of savings, so that's great. But the battery storage right now, the energy storage just doesn't seem to pencil out as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it's where those incentives make sense, or where you can actually, use it to the best of your ability.
Yeah, I mean, in California, you have a really aggressive storage incentive, right?
Yep.
So that's
Absolutely.
But it's like most things that are new, right? When they first come out, they're really expensive, and as they start to become more uptake, and who remembers cell phones when they were like this big, and look at the size of them now, and the cost of them now. And just another quick point: a true microgrid is really having a mixed source of different types of DG, like having solar, having energy storage, having cogen, having wind if you've got wind around you, having all of these mixes. And when it's windy, let's use the wind, and when it's sunny, let's use the sun, and when there's no sun and no wind, let's use the cogen. And having the automation of that type of system to have a mixed source of different distributed energy resources to provide, multiple buildings. That's what a microgrid is, right?
Yeah.
So we have solar at 2 of our buildings, actually. We have it at the Helena, which is 601 West 57th Street, which is a residential building. We also have, we installed it at one of the first green skyscrapers, which was 4 Times Square back in 1998. Again, in New York City, there's not a lot of space in terms of footprint to put solar in, so a lot of these solar systems are built into the curtain wall panels. Very expensive to do, not at the right angle to support solar, so the paybacks are not really penciling out on those, and in some cases those paybacks get into the 100-year period for 4 Times Square. But we are looking at solar in certain areas on landfills, so we're teaming up with a company that is trying to work with the Parks Department, who owns some of these existing landfills, and we're trying to get the Parks Department to approve it for use of possibly up to 4 2-megawatt installations on a net metered basis, so we can put those solar installations up in a landfill in the Bronx and have it net metered against our buildings in Midtown Manhattan. We think those work out great because, again, you have the space. There's also working with the community and the Parks Department to bring or redevelop that area so it can be kind of used as a park, even though it's not really used as a park right now, and they say it's owned by Parks Department, so it's got to be used as a park, but it's an old landfill. So, again, trying to repurpose the space for both solar and maybe the edge of it to be used as a park for the community would be great. In terms of energy storage, we are looking at energy storage. Lithium polymer, lithium ion batteries have greatly increased the energy storage market in terms of usability. Biggest problem we're having right now is obviously FDNY doesn't like to have lithium ion batteries due to thermal runaway in basements of large commercial buildings. They have a big problem with it. We actually had a meeting with them because, again, as part of our Hallett's Point cogen, it's off the grid. We have a certain level which we have to run the engines at for emissions. So we have to run those at 50%. So we are planning to install an energy storage system so that under low load conditions, we can use that battery system as a load on the engines. And then we, under that same low load condition, after the batteries are fully charged, we'll turn off the engines and just run the entire site on batteries. Problem again is that the fire department hasn't approved these energy storage systems. Again, with lithium ion, they're, I think, only approved right now with lead acid, and they make you really do some serious work to keep that lead acid contained. Again, we think lithium ion is great because there's a lot more cycles. You can cycle this every day. You can cycle it multiple times a day. Some of these battery systems are upwards of 5,000, 10,000 cycles before you have to replace the batteries. There's other technology which we're looking at. One is a zinc metal hybrid. There's also another type of lithium iron phosphate type battery, which is supposed to be safer than lithium ion. So there's all these different types of technologies, which again is great in terms of the cycles and how long they last, and the fact you don't have to replace it for 10 or 20 years in some cases. But again, another hurdle is that we're trying to break ground with is the fire department, and we're working through those things. If we have to build a vault and massive amounts of fire protection systems to make the fire department feel safe that they're not going to have to walk into a blaze to protect the space, or the building's not going to burn down, or we're going to try and do that. Obviously, it's got to fit the business case.
Great. Well, we've had a couple of good questions come in, and I'm glad they're all good, but I'm glad this one came up in particular because we talked about this one backstage. This is directed at both you, Kirby, and you, Kylie, but I think anyone can answer. Is there any plans or considerations to implement EV charging infrastructure into your sites? And I think, Kirby, you could start us off with a fun fact about the W up in Times Square.
Sure thing. Absolutely. So thank you for that question. Starwood takes EV and EV charging extremely seriously. We have partnered with several vendors to bring charging to our properties as really the way we look at it, it's almost like the Wi-Fi of the future, right? You're going to want, as a guest, if you have an electric vehicle, to have that charger at that property for your car. In fact, just like a fun fact or a quick kind of stat to go through this. So over the last 2.5 years, maybe 2 years, we went from a very small handful of electric vehicle chargers to over 200 installed all around the globe in all of our different divisions, which encompass pretty much every continent for electric charging. A lot of this was driven by need. So it's those wants. It's our guests really wanting to have electric charging at the properties, as well as just our envisioning of what we want to be able to provide from a services perspective. And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, where it's that integration with what other kinds of aspects can we bring from an AE or from kind of an energy perspective that add to that guest experience. Plus, the fact that our CEO also had a electric car and that he needed a place to charge it both at the headquarters and both downtown here in New York City did make a huge difference and give me a very big impetus to ensure that those types of things were installed.
Yeah, same with Whole Foods. You know, this is technology of the future that all of our customers are going to be starting to use. So very high on our priority list to be able to give them this amenity. I think really cool things that have come up with electric vehicle charging are the different types of financing for it. So we own some of the electric vehicle chargers at our stores, but also some of them now we don't own, and they're owned by a third party who we work with, you know, to provide the electric vehicle charging because our primary purpose is to sell food. And, you know, they'll provide the power and sell the electricity to people to charge their cars. So I think these different financing models have also really helped us to expand it across the nation.
100% agree with Kylie. So that fact, and we work with multiple different vendors, that you can provide these different type of models for your owners. I mean, some owners want a free charger, that's it. They want to be able to do it, not have them cost anything to buy or purchase or anything like that. And we have that as an option. Others do want that model where they're able to basically generate a little bit of additional revenue from being able to do that. And you have to have that flexibility to offer it to them. I mean, to get that kind of integration or that acceptance with your owners to have those installed at your properties.
Yeah. And it's also just a really cool little market to follow.
Totally,
a market to follow just because stations that we installed 3 years ago now are just so out of date almost. You know, and so it's changing so fast and it's so fascinating.
Yeah, there's no brakes on that market. It's really moving out at pretty high speed.
Vishnu, you had some thoughts on this as well.
Electric, one of the first projects we did a mix of cogen and solar, and it was actually for a hospital, and it's really interesting because the original scheme that the customer wanted to do was like a 3.5 meg cogen system, 3.5 meg solar system with carports everywhere, and the economics for carports, you know, they're quite tough because they're expensive per kW installed. So we ended up scaling it back, and we had 4 cogens and a solar PV on the roof, which makes sense, and then we installed just the carports just for the doctors because they all had electric cars. And actually one of the interesting takes for me, again, being new in town, was obviously the weather pattern over here is quite different to the UK where I'm from. We get a lot of snow and we get a lot of sun. And these carports actually provided added benefit in keeping snow off the cars, you know, in the times when there was a lot of snow, and obviously keeping the cars a little bit cooler in the summertime. And the hospital was also able, via the charging stations, to charge for the energy to provide to the doctors and their electric vehicle cars.
So the hospital the doctor actually paid for charging. So in that scenario,
I don't know how they actually worked it out because
Okay.
we didn't get involved with that bit, and I think
Okay.
they're a not-for-profit, so I don't know. But there was a credit card system of some shape or form that had to go in before kilowatts started coming from the sun to charge these cars. So,
noted.
maybe it was factored into the maintenance side of things. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I wonder if EV charging will be added to parking fees at hotels anytime soon. Could be. Switching topics a bit.
I'm going to take the fifth on that one.
I had to put it out there. What about geothermal systems for your facilities? Is anyone looking at that?
Yes, we have geothermal systems installed for our properties. I mean, some in ground source heat pumps and some a little bit higher scale. It's one of that, as I was kind of alluding to, pieces of the mix that we try to bring when you bring these different things to bear. I mean, obviously, with some properties on the Pacific Rim, it's much easier to do a geothermal project than it is, say, at our headquarters in Connecticut. So you just have to look at what really kind of makes sense.
Great. Phil, I think this one is for you, and I'm going to try and catch the spirit of this question. We're back on standby tariffs.
Oh, boy.
Can you give, I guess for folks in the room, I think the thought is to get a bit more tangible. Can you give a 1 month example of how a standby rate is not favorable or punitive in terms of how does it impact either a lease fee or a dollar per kilowatt hour issue or demand charges? I think providing a bit more context as to how punitive it is on a sort of per resident or per unit basis.
Well, it's really not, again, where we have cogen for One Bride Park, it's in a commercial building. The cogen really it's kind of stands between the building and the utility. So the cogen acts almost as the utility to the building in terms of all the energy bought by the building is bought through the cogen, and whatever the cogen can't make, it buys from the grid. Again, those standby rates on a monthly basis, from the steam side, it's roughly on the order of it's probably an $80,000 hit on a standby charge on a monthly basis. In terms of on the electric side, it's probably, it's hard to say exactly, but it's upwards of $700,000 difference than, again, a year different than if I was on an SC9 rate and I never shut down. It's hard to compare these two because they're so drastically different. You have to really look at when you shut down and the shoulder seasons. If I'm going to shut down on the shoulder seasons, I can do 2 shutdowns a year, and if I blow the demand charges on 2 months out of the year, I would almost still be better than if I stay on the standby tariff. So again, it's hard to kind of compare the two in terms of cost per kilowatt hour. Again, because of there's these contract demand charges that are added on top, but it drastically increases the payback. I can't say the exact, per kilowatt numbers. It's hard to kind of put it into per kilowatt hour.
And just from a distinction, there's different standby tariffs. You're experiencing steam ones and electric ones. On the flip side, Con Ed have a cogen gas rate now. They're giving 33% discount to gas going into cogen in certain scenarios, but particularly for steam, it must be really painful.
The steam is painful. Again, we are on that gas. That tariff is it's a Rider H tariff.
Rider H.
Yeah. Rider H is a CHP tariff. We do get a discount in the gas to do that. Con Ed actually did come back to us because we only make, with the heat rejection off the engine, we make about 12,000 pounds or 12 M-pounds worth of steam. So we have a duct burner that actually takes gas and injects it into the HRSG, into the heat recovery steam generator, which then fires that upwards of up to 40, 50 M-pounds, which is what the building could potentially use. Con Ed came back to us and they said, well, because that's really gas into a boiler and doesn't really go into the engine, they wanted to actually take the majority of that gas off the Rider H. And we said, well, the only way to do that is if you put a sub-meter up there, we would be willing to do that. And Con Ed wasn't willing to do that. They wanted us to run new lines, and we couldn't do that from a meter room. So again, there's certain things with that Rider H which is a benefit, but it's still not. It still doesn't help the steam, and it doesn't help the electric. Again, the electric is getting better with these REV proceedings that are going on with the Public Service Commission. There have been certain changes that are a benefit, but I don't think we're there yet enough to truly incentivize CHP, large CHP at least.
Great. Kirby, this next question's for you, but I think Vishnu, I'd also be curious your thoughts as well. So the question is, hotels are a great opportunity to expose the public to new energy management technologies. Mm-hmm. But because customers, particularly yours, are not local energy customers, utilities can't, it's challenging for utilities to actually incentivize hotel programs. How do you kind of see this playing out, or how do you see energy management technologies and programs being implementable in kind of your business model?
Sure, and I appreciate whoever asked the question. I'm happy to follow up with you afterwards as well. Let me start by giving you a couple examples where we've tried it and maybe have a little bit more of a development need, or there's some room for improvement. So I'm not sure who has traveled overseas, but a lot of times overseas, your thermostat in your room is controlled by a little card that you can slip in, and that will allow the air to cool down or heat up when you are in the room. So everybody is extremely clever. A lot of folks have figured out that, well, I will just get 2 cards. I will take 1 card with me, and then we'll leave the other card within the thermostat and crank that AC all the way down. So I'm not sure that necessarily helped us from like an EMS type of perspective. We've tried other types of solutions where a lot of times we'll do sensors within the room, and we really take seriously our interaction with our brands and with our properties to make sure that what we do is seamless. Sometimes we have done it so much that it is too seamless, where people do not see the sensors and do not see the things in the room to really notice that when I leave, these lights are going to go off. Or when I am motionless in the bathtub area, that is going to shut the lights off in there at an inopportune time. So, really.
Let's hope they're not motionless for too long.
Yes.
Okay.
But anyways. Yeah. I didn't go there. But anyways, so from that perspective, yes, and we're always open to new ideas. We're always open to new solutions and looking at these things from that standpoint. However, the one thing, and this really applies to pretty much everything, the whole panel, and I'm sure my colleagues would say the same thing with us today, is we've always found that it's best to try and pilot these types of approaches to find the ones that work and the ones that we want to reinforce, as well as the ones that we might let die in the vine or that might not be learned. Hopefully that answers the question.
Vishnu, you've implemented projects across a number of industries. What have you seen?
From what perspective? Sorry?
Really from energy management, kind of the implementation of energy management technologies and kind of getting the interaction and adoption from various different businesses.
Yeah, I mean, again, going back to where I came from, legislation has driven a lot of the uptake of energy efficiency in Europe, particularly, and some of that may be based on money. Some of it may be based on carbon footprint. Some of it may be based on, there's a league table in the back of The Guardian every week that publishes who's green and who's not, and people shop by that league table in Europe. And then also from a planning perspective, off the back of this 2008 thing I told you guys about for the carbon tax, new buildings now, about over 25,000 square foot, have to generate a certain portion of energy from within the building. So they have to have cogen, they have to have solar, they have to have solar hot water, they have to have a bunch, and it started off at being like 10-15% back in 2008. This year it's 40%. Wow. So 40% of the energy that building needs to run has to come from the building in some shape or form. Going back to some of the the bigger entities like these guys, all 3 of these guys that have got big portfolios, corporate statements sometimes can help. I've seen with us going back to some of that supermarket back in Europe when I was in that game, the high end supermarkets versus the low end supermarkets, they build their stores. One might be a shed with very little in it, and one might be a really fancy supermarket with doors and LED lights and all kinds of, but the first cost to build that store is really, really high. I've mentioned to you guys about this carbon neutral stores, or a few of them that they built, and the running costs could be, a lot better. I mean, it's the age-old adage, right? It's residential buildings, they used to have here, a lot of them used to have through the window PTAC units, and we've worked out that that's really expensive and not too reliable, and it leaks if they're not sealed up properly. And so now they're all going down the heat pump scenario, or the water source heat pump, and having 4 pipe systems, a heating leg and a cooling leg. So there's lots of different drivers, but in Europe it started up by carbon abatement, then it started to become policy. To drive into London now, you have to pay a carbon tax with your car. You've got a congestion charge, sure, which you pay every day. And over and above that now, they've now introduced, if anyone here knows London, there's a road around London called the M25, and there's now a low carbon emission zone. For a truck, that's 60 to 80 pounds a day to
one
drive
thing,
into the zone.
And actually Vishnu reminded me of this too, is, and I'd be more, I'm sure the other panelists would agree, is as linked to EMS and energy management, what we're seeing more and more, and I'm sure everyone else as well, is that fact that data is power. So regardless of what you are trying, the ability to measure it, track it, report it, and work against it is key and is critical. And I think that's inherently linked in not only that EMS question that you just asked, but everything else as well. I mean, I don't know what you guys think, but
So we actually are starting to try and roll out dashboards. Again, our major commercial buildings have a massive amount of sub-metering data Coming in, we're not only metering what every tenant is doing, we're metering a lot of the back of house spaces, how much it takes to actually make a ton hour of chilled water. Not many people know that. We actually do know that. We measure every bit of the energy that goes into the chiller plant. We actually measure BTUs on an output side, and we can actually equate, we know it's an average of 27 to 33 cents per ton hour to make a ton hour of chilled water. We're trying to roll out these dashboards to our major commercial tenants, guys like Bank of America, Skadden Arps, all the major commercial tenants, to try and show them what they actually what is their impact on the building. And part of those dashboards actually show, what's the demand of the building and what their piece of that demand is at the time. And it kind of shows them an impact. Now, large commercial tenants aren't really that concerned about even $1 million electric bill a year. It really doesn't concern them because they make lots more money than that, but they are concerned about how people perceive them. So if they can show that they're being green, if they can show that they're reducing their energy use on their floors, it gives them a marketing tool. It gives them a way to, market themselves as being green.
Yeah, so our panelists are already, you guys scooped my next question, which is really the role of software. So we're kind of starting to get into this conversation on the importance of data and software, but the specific question is, what do you think what will be the role of software? How will it need to integrate with your systems? We kind of started talking about that. And in particular, who do you guys see as exciting players in this space, or any demos that you guys have done with software providers that have proven out? Kylie, I'll start with you, because we were talking about kind of this whole notion of being able to kind of regionally manage your stores and be able to kind of have that sort of seamless view and seamless integration. Do you have any kind of thoughts or?
Yeah, I think software and also accessibility to software is going to be key. Where, I've worked with refrigeration providers and other types of energy providers who can just pull up an app on their phone and look at all their projects that they have working on it. Like that, to have that at a regional level for us would be key in managing all the facilities. Where obviously this kind of goes back to that, how automated do we want our systems question. We would love it to be automated to that certain point where the human touch is going to be needed. So software is key, I guess.
Vishnu?
We use a lot of software in our systems, and we actually have our own energy management system and stuff back in Europe. We don't have it here, but just maybe focusing on the cogen side of stuff. That's an integral part of a cogen system, because knowledge is power, and if you don't know how it's performing, how it's running efficiently, how much gas it's consuming, how much electricity it's producing, how much of the heat energy is actually being used as opposed to just total heat that's being produced and being dumped out into the atmosphere. And I could go onto my iPhone now, and we have an app-based system for all of our cogens, and I could plug into each one of them, and you can see how much each one's run, how much gas it's consumed, how much it's produced. And with data and reporting off the back of that, NYSERDA, for example, with cogen again requires a 5-year maintenance contract, which also includes all the metering and verification of the system for those 5 years to prove that it's actually doing what it says on the tin. So it's an integral part. When I started in this game a long time ago, it was all telephone, ADSL line. And now you just need an internet connection, right? Except if you're trying to do cogen at the MI5 building or the CIA building. They didn't like that. I mean, we've got cogen at Buckingham Palace, at 10 Downing Street, at Houses of Parliament, Windsor Castle. We've got it everywhere. And, sometimes getting a telephone line or an internet connection in those scenarios can be a bit tricky.
Right. Kirby?
Yeah, so software is a huge integrator for us in terms of what we do with that data that we're collecting and what we want to track as well as report against and act against. And it's integrated not only from that standpoint, I think the point that we were talking about earlier, where it's, how much control do you have at one spot, how much can some people do versus how much you have at that property. And I think it's really a mix. I think you really have to balance that. You do not want to take away so much control from that DOE that they are not, the director of engineering at your property, that they are not able to do their job, that they are not able to plan for events and give that guest their best kind of expectation. But you want to know what's going on. it all kind of still comes back where it's, what can you do? How can you apply these things? We've gone through instances where we've actually recently converted our platform on tracking from kind of our homegrown kind of Frankenstein-based system to one that is much more malleable and something that we can use to really kind of incorporate all of the data that we're receiving. And that's the thing. We ran out of room. You ran out of what you can do on an Excel farm as far as stuff out there. But the one point that I would raise on this, and the one thing that I think is just key for us is, a good friend of mine always used to say that a fool with a tool is still a fool. So it's being able to use those things and apply them in the best manner properly. And a lot of that, it's how well do you train? How well do you socialize? How well do you work with those people to make sure that it's a solution that works for everyone, not just one person at one point?
Great.
Yeah, a software program can't change a spark plug on an engine.
No.
Right.
We're talking about a lot of data.
Right.
At some point, too much data is no good too. So
Yeah.
again, collection of data is one thing, but actual real-time management of energy is a whole nother solution that I haven't seen yet. We're seeing trending and, okay, we have all this data and we go back and look at what we did and try to make tweaks to see if it helps, but trying to make changes in real time is a little tougher to do. I touched on this at the beginning about possible machine learning or smart controls, having, being able to map a system level curve, not just one piece of equipment. We know what that chiller curve is. We know what that heat pump curve is in terms of where it runs best in terms of its efficiency. We know individual curves to try and plot it on a system level to know exactly where you want to run those systems to be as efficient as they possibly can be. We haven't seen it yet. We are doing some trials of certain systems. One of them in the room in front of us over here, EcoRhythm. We are trying them right now. We'll see how it works out. We haven't really gotten into it yet, but we'll see. But again, they're kind of doing stuff that's a little different. It's starting to get into that machine learning where they're looking for anomalies and trends that are kind of different than whether it's a building system, whether it's whatever it is. They're looking for trends that are kind of bouncing around and not steady state. And by knowing where you're kind of, bouncing around, you could try and auto-tune or fine-tune those areas. Again, getting back into machine learning, that would be great if we could do something like that. I don't know that we're there yet. There's many, many variables in these systems that very hard to calculate, and you really couldn't do it by hand. You need to really have a system that can really look at it as a whole, as multiple variables in one set time and make an adjustment in real time.
Great. I have one more audience question before we kind of get to closing remarks. And I have to say I've moderated plenty of panels, whether they're here or elsewhere, and this question always comes up. Usually I know the answer to it, but I always like to ask it and see what folks say. But the inevitable question, do we need the grid? And why can't we just cut the wire?
You know my answer.
I know your answer. From Kirby, from your perspective, I mean, St. John might be one example, one extreme example, but in terms of kind of do we need the grid in most scenarios?
Sure. So Starwood is not a power company. I mean, we provide hotels. We provide an experience for our guests. So yes, we want to bring all of the energy solutions that we can to play and to the market. But there are areas where people who do that job and who do that job very well have the economies of scale that make these things work. Right. I don't think saying you don't need one of this or you don't need one of that is necessarily the answer. I think inclusion is the answer. I think having all of these different tools and being able to bring them to bear, that's what you want to try for. It's funny that they ask this question all the time.
Oh, I get it all the time. And as a former utility employee at PG&E, I got this plenty of times. Vishnu.
I don't know the answer to that. I know from what my company do, we build, own and operate power systems, power plants. We have them for towns. We have energy from waste plants that we build. We have all types of different mixed energy systems. I agree. We're not at the point, because reliability is one of the biggest things, right? And then cost. or cost, or maybe cost and then reliability. But I don't think we're at the point yet where we can say the whole of the USA could go off-grid. And then if we talk about, what's the alternative? We're going to use solar PV right now when it's dark outside? We can't, right? So there needs to be, I think it goes back to this microgrid type similar scenario, and maybe a district energy type system, which is on the thermal side or on the cooling side. Again, I'm sorry to keep harping on about Europe, but London is a big district energy system. In the early 70s, I think it was, the first one was built in a constituent called Merton, and they put pipes in the ground, and ever since, every new development now has to build a little district energy system, and it all connects. There's a massive heat and cooling network all under the whole of London, so that buildings are sharing heat, buildings are sharing cooling. They haven't gone down the microgrid route in any big way. There's communities that have microgrids, but I think it's maybe it's a function of time and cost. One of the big prohibitive factors as well is obviously the utility or the grid is quite expensive to keep going, and
Yes.
some of the power stations, the utility, we all, again, on my non-Con Ed hating piece, they have installed capacity similar to your buildings with your larger cogens, where you've got these 5-6 megawatts of cogen that you can't run at full pelt, and cogen's less efficient when it's running at part load. The utility is a big version of that in some shape or form. They're looking to have power available when everybody's got their air conditioning on and it's 95 degrees Fahrenheit outside, but how often does that happen per year? It may happen a week this year, it may happen one day next year, it may not happen the following, and there's all these power stations that are around that have the capability of providing that power. And then if we came to the summer and I believe in 2006 there was an event where the grid failed and it was no one could get air conditioning and stuff, and then people were outside in the streets, and so I think we can move towards a point where we're not so reliant on the grid, and there's a bunch of mixed use energy sources: solar, wind, cogen, geothermal. We've done geothermal. We have a geothermal company in Europe where we've put projects in for hospitals where we've got cogen, and the cogen's been oversized thermally, and we dump the heat into the ground, and the geothermal loop takes the heat and uses the COP on the heat pumps and generates air conditioning. We've done projects like that. We've done them for supermarkets and stuff like that. So I think there may be a time when it may become more localized,
Right.
but at this point in time, I don't think we can do without the grid. Personally.
Kylie, any thoughts different from these guys?
Honestly, I think they said it the best that it could be said, where it's a combination of things. And also, like right now, the grid is our connection to our community. So, if we can produce more power than we need, it's the microgrid concept, the resiliency concept, where how do we get it to the school next door, or the bank next door, to keep people's lives running smoothly in the community. So, but I think honestly, you both said it tremendously.
Yeah, and again, even though we are doing an off-the-grid plant, that doesn't mean that it's not needed. Again, in certain cases, in this case, we don't need it right now. Again, if tariffs change, we may look for a way to connect that system to the grid in the future. Right now, it doesn't pay for us to do that. It pays for us to take that capital cost and add it for reliability than to pay to connect it to the grid. But in the future, it wouldn't be a bad thing to support the community, support the area around the community, support that local grid or that local microgrid. Again, for residences, it really wouldn't make sense to go off the grid, obviously, because they can't do anything with the heat. So you're making electricity only on peak times, and it wouldn't make sense on small scale. So I think the grid is still needed, obviously, but in certain cases, we're not going to use it.
Great. So just kind of closing remarks, and I'll start with you. I mean, we have a lot of smart folks in the room who are kind of come from all different parts of the energy ecosystem. I mean, is there any kind of just thought you want to leave them with, or kind of ask of the industry in terms of how to tackle some of these challenges that we discussed moving forward?
I guess from more of a financial standpoint, how do we get a lot of these systems implemented? It's, again, we're looking for, I'm always looking for what's the next big thing out there. What what does somebody have to offer us that really shows a payback, that really meets a business case, that really is an effective either tool or piece of equipment that works the way it's supposed to work. Obviously, a lot of people are selling equipment. A lot of people are,
Yep.
you know, times are good right now. We get a lot of phone calls. We get a lot of emails about certain systems. Sometimes it's just a sales call. Sometimes we get an engineer on the other end that really has something, a good story to tell. So how, you know, we're always trying new things. We always want to keep that, you know, that I'm going to call it the cutting edge, but sometimes the bleeding edge too. We do want to do that, but, you know, we need some of that, those systems to be explained in an engineering term. We need them to make sense from an engineering standpoint first before we could really implement them. So,
Kylie?
I think our biggest ask, if you will, is just the communication side of it, making sure that there's that streamlined communication between utility body incentive or state energy body, the owner, us, the technology users, and just making sure that everyone there is working together so that things don't come up, you know, where the new technology might not be accepted by the utility. And even though the incentives are, you know, paying for us to install that new technology, you know, hitting these roadblocks, really smoothing out these roadblocks, I think would help the implementation of these technologies, new and energy-saving technologies at our stores.
Vishnu?
No, I kind of agree completely with you, and I just kind of wanted to say that, you know, we're heading in the right direction. When I was younger and I used to come here on vacation, I used to see energy wasted a lot, same as when I was younger in England. And, you know, people are thinking about it more now. We're thinking about reliability. We see these major weather events that have caused impact to, you know, our livelihood, to our kids and to our families. I think, you know, knowledge is power. I think having events like these and people thinking on their feet and trying to work with the utilities, you know, not always hating on the utilities, but trying to work with them and trying to come up with alternative methods of doing or implementing. And I think microgrids and district energy systems is definitely a good opportunity for everybody to make, you know, for ourselves, our future, for our kids, and to help with the environment and reduce the carbon impacts. And obviously try, as more things become a bigger uptake in stuff, then costs tend to come down. So, you know, it's all about being smart and turn off the light if you're not using it.
Yeah. Kirby, you want to close us out?
Sure. So just on behalf of my fellow esteemed panelists, I would like to thank Clean Energy Connections for having us here today, and for our hosts. We really appreciate it. And thank you very much for moderating. We really appreciate that as well. And just from a closing thought perspective, so something that I've really looked at when I've looked at, you know, what we're talking about today is our, you know, in recent past, our mission statement for Starwood was giving people a better way to experience the world. So that's really kind of what our organization was driving on. So for me and for what I do in sustainability for Starwood I was always trying to work to make sure that we were giving people a better world to experience. So I would just ask everyone who is here today and watching at home to think about how you can apply those things in your role and in your job and what you do in a day-to-day life. I love the turn off the lights example. I'm constantly reiterating that at home with my 10-year-old daughter. And thank you again for having us.
Great. Thanks everyone to the panelists. Well, everyone thank the panelists. Sorry. Great discussion. I think almost everyone will be sticking around if you have individual questions. And Rachel, if I'm not mistaken, I think the bar is now reopened for folks. Okay, great. So look forward to additional dialogue, and thanks again, everyone, for attending.